Welcome to the Useless Hour. Tonight, we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. Somewhere in your home, most likely within a few steps of the front door, there is a small accumulation of paper that nobody asked for. It arrives at a steady rate, unbidden, requiring nothing of you and receiving nothing from you. A leaflet for a pizza place you have not been to, a card offering to buy your house, a folded sheet in a color that does not occur in nature, announcing that a window company is, for reasons of its own, operating at a loss this month. You pick it up, you carry it 4 feet, you put it in the recycling, and the entire transaction is concluded, without a single thought passing through you on the way. It is the most ignored category of object in the modern world, and it is also one of the most persistent, and it has been arriving in one form or another for a very long time indeed. Tonight, we are going to follow that pile backwards. Not the paper itself particularly, but the impulse behind it. The specific and apparently unkillable human conviction that if a message can reach a stranger, a message should reach a stranger, and it should be about a product. That impulse has a documented starting point, or at least the earliest starting point anyone has been able to pin down and produce evidence for, and it is not where most people would guess. It is not on paper at all. It is on a wire in London in the late spring of 1864, and it concerns a dentist. We should begin with the wire, because without the wire, none of it makes sense. By the 1860s, the Electric Telegraph had been in commercial operation in Britain for something over 2 decades, and it had done to the country roughly what one might expect. Distance, which had always been a matter of days, became a matter of minutes. News of a death in Edinburgh could reach a family in London before the household had finished breakfast. Prices moved. Trains were controlled. A murderer was famously arrested some years earlier because a description of him outran his own train. The wire was the fastest thing in the world, and everybody understood exactly what it was for, in the way that people understand the things they have recently been given. It was for urgency. That is the point to hold on to for the rest of the hour, because everything that follows rests on it. A telegram was expensive, not ruinously, not by the standards of the people we are about to meet, but expensive enough that you counted the words, and you dropped the small, polite ones, and you arrived at that clipped, breathless register that telegrams have in every novel written since. Nobody sent a telegram to say hello. Nobody sent one to pass the time. You sent one because something had happened that could not wait for the post, a birth, a death, a collapse in a share price, a train that had to be met. And crucially, a telegram was not delivered to a slot in your door to be found at your convenience. It was carried the last stretch of its journey by a human being, usually a boy, on foot or on a bicycle, and it was handed over. Somebody knocked. Somebody in the household went to answer, and there on the step was a uniformed messenger holding a small envelope, and in the half-second before it was opened, everyone within earshot understood that the shape of the day might be about to change. That is what a telegram meant, a knock at an hour when there should be no knock, and bad news in a stranger's hand. Now, in May of 1864, a number of prominent people in London, members of Parliament among them, along with others of standing, heard that knock. The messenger was there, the envelope was handed over, and inside, in the clipped telegraphic style reserved for emergencies, was an announcement from a firm of dentists. The firm was Messrs. Gabriel of 27 Harley Street, Cavendish Square, in the West End of London. a practice of some reputation in an address that already carried, even then, the particular medical respectability that street has never quite shaken off. The message was not sinister. It was not even, on its own terms, unreasonable. It informed the recipient that until October, the Gabriel's professional attendance at Harley Street would be from 10 o'clock until 5. That is the whole of it. That is the artifact. Opening hours for a dentist sent down the most urgent communication channel then in existence to people who had not asked, at a cost the sender had cheerfully absorbed, and delivered into a moment engineered by every prior use of that channel to feel like catastrophe. Take a moment to be one of those recipients. You are at home, or at your club, or in the middle of something. There is a knock. It is the telegraph boy. Your first thought is your mother, or your brother at sea, or the business. Your hands do the thing hands do. You open it, and the news, the urgent news that has come flying down a copper wire to find you specifically, is that a dental practice you have never used will be open in the afternoons for the next 5 months. They were, as you might expect, furious. The indignation was of a very peculiar Victorian kind, which is to say that it was less about the inconvenience than about the impertinence. One recipient took the entirely conventional step of writing to the Times, and the letter was printed on the 1st of June, 1864. He records that he has never had any dealings whatever with Messrs. Gabriel, and then he asks the question that is really the whole of the next 160 years compressed into a single sentence. By what right, he wants to know, do they disturb him with a telegram which is evidently simply the medium of an advertisement? By what right? It is worth being careful here and precise, because this story is very often told with more confidence than the evidence supports. We cannot say that this was the first unsolicited advertisement in human history. The history of shouting at strangers about goods is as old as goods. We cannot even say with certainty that it was the first advertisement ever pushed down a private wire, because a great many telegrams were sent in those years, and almost none of them survive. What can be said, and what is generally accepted by the people who have gone looking, is that this is the earliest well-documented instance of unsolicited mass advertising delivered through a channel built for private, urgent, personal messages, the earliest one, at any rate, that somebody was annoyed enough to complain about in a newspaper that we can still read. And that is the more interesting claim, because the complaint is the evidence. The advertisement survives only because it offended someone. Which brings us to the shape of the thing, the pattern that will run under everything else tonight, and which you may find you recognize. A channel is opened. It is built at great expense for something serious, for emergencies, for love, for commerce between people who already know one another. It is treated at first with a kind of reverence because it is rare, and it is dear, and it means something when it is used. And then, always, without exception, within a remarkably short time, somebody works out that the channel reaches people, and that reaching people is what selling requires, and the reverence is quietly converted into inventory. Then comes the outrage. And the outrage is always the same outrage. Not that the message is untrue or even unwelcome in itself, but that it came through the door reserved for things that mattered. We will watch this happen again and again. The wire, the post, the catalogue, the mailing list, the electronic mail, the telephone, the small rectangle of glass beside you. Different centuries, different technologies, identical grievance, phrased in almost identical words each time, by people who were quite sure that theirs was the first violation of its kind. None of this needs your attention tonight. The paper by your door will still be there in the morning, and it will not mind having been ignored. But hold on to the dentist, because he is the beginning of the line. A firm in Harley Street, open from 10 until 5, until October. Before anyone could be sent something they had not asked for, there had to be a way of sending things at all. This sounds obvious, and it is obvious, but it repays a moment's attention, because the thing we are describing is not really a message, it is a system. An unwanted letter is a delivery network with something unwanted placed inside it, and the network is the older and stranger invention of the two. It had to be built, it had to be paid for, and for most of its history it was arranged in a way that made unsolicited mail not merely rude, but structurally impossible. To understand why, you have to understand who used to pay. For the greater part of the history of the British Post, the person who paid for a letter was not the person who wrote it, it was the person who received it. The letter travelled on credit, and the bill came due at the door. When the postman arrived, he arrived not with a gift, but with an invoice, and the price was calculated by two things: how far the letter had come, and how many sheets of paper it was made of. Both halves of that calculation shaped the way people wrote. Distance meant that a letter from the next county cost less than a letter from Scotland, and that the postal map of the country was really a map of expense, radiating outward from wherever you happened to be standing. The counting of sheets meant something stranger. A single sheet, folded and sealed and addressed on the outside, was one rate. A second sheet doubled it. An enclosure of any kind doubled it. An envelope, an entirely separate piece of paper wrapped around the letter, counted as another sheet, and so for most people, envelopes simply did not exist. The letter was its own envelope. You wrote, you folded, you sealed the fold with wax, and you addressed the blank outer face. And when a single sheet was all you could afford, and you still had more to say, you turned the page 90 degrees and wrote across your own handwriting at right angles, a second layer of words laid over the first in a lattice. This was called cross-writing, and it was entirely normal. Whole correspondences survive in it. People read these letters the way you might read a page through a fence, and they did it because paper was cheap and postage was not. What did it actually cost? In the last years of the old system, a single sheet carried from London to Edinburgh cost a shilling and a penny halfpenny, which for a labouring man was not a trivial sum, and could stand comparison with a day's wages. A letter then was a financial event. It arrived, and you had to decide whether you could afford to know what it said. Many people decided that they could not. Refusing a letter at the door was ordinary practice, and the post office carried, at its own expense, a great volume of correspondence that was conveyed the length of the country and then declined on a doorstep by someone who did not have the money, or did not recognize the hand, or had simply had enough of paying to be written to. Out of that refusal grew a small and rather beautiful piece of ingenuity. If the charge fell due only on acceptance, then anything visible on the outside of the letter was free, and so people arranged codes in advance. A particular flourish under the address, a mark in the corner, the angle of the writing, the way the name was abbreviated, an agreed sign meaning "we are well," or "the child is born," or "do not come." The recipient would take the letter from the postman, turn it over, read what she needed to know from the outside of it, and hand it back unopened and unpaid. The message had been delivered. The post office had carried it for nothing. This story was told and retold by the reformers of the 1830s, who found in it exactly the argument they needed, that a system which charges for knowledge will simply be routed around by people determined to have it. There was, of course, one class of person for whom none of this applied. Members of Parliament and peers held the privilege of franking, which allowed them to send letters free by signing the outer face. The privilege was extended, borrowed, traded, and abused with tremendous enthusiasm, and franked covers moved around the country in numbers that nobody in the post office found amusing. But hold the ordinary case in your mind, because it is the important one. If the recipient pays, then writing to a stranger is pointless. You cannot advertise to a man who must hand over a coin before he can discover that he is being advertised to. He will refuse the letter. He will always refuse the letter. Under recipient-paid postage, the only letters worth sending are letters someone is already waiting for. The system had a kind of immune response built into its pricing, and it worked perfectly, for centuries, entirely by accident. The alternative had already been demonstrated and then quietly shelved. In 1680, a London merchant named William Dockwra set up a penny post within the capital, a flat charge of 1 penny, paid in advance by the sender, with hand stamps marking the letter to show where it had been taken in and at what hour. It worked, it was popular, and within 2 years it had been absorbed by the Crown as an infringement of the royal monopoly on carrying letters, and its founder was for a time out of the business he had invented. The principle sat there, proven, on a scale of a few square miles, for 160 years. It was taken up again by a man named Rowland Hill. In 1837, he published a pamphlet, The Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability, and its central insight was not about kindness or access or the improvement of the laboring classes, though he was happy to speak about all three. It was about arithmetic. Hill argued that the cost of actually carrying a letter from one end of the country to the other was extremely small, and that the great expense of the post office lay in the machinery of charging, the clerks computing distances, the accounting, the collection of money at 10,000 doors, the letters carried and then refused. Remove the calculation, he said, and you remove the cost. Charge 1 penny. Charge it everywhere, without regard to distance. Charge it by weight rather than by sheets, and charge it, above all, in advance. The uniform penny post came into force on the 10th of January, 1940. 4 months later, on the 6th of May, the post office began accepting a small rectangle of engraved paper, gummed on the back, bearing the profile of the young queen against a black ground, the penny black, the first adhesive postage stamp used anywhere in the world. It was issued alongside an ornate pictorial envelope designed by the artist William Mulready, which the public found ridiculous and which was withdrawn. The stamp stayed, and the country began, quite suddenly, to write. In 1839, under the old system, 76 million letters were posted in the United Kingdom. In 1840, the first year of the penny post, the figure was around 168 million. By 1850, it had roughly doubled again, to some 347 million. In 11 years, the nation had gone from writing to each other occasionally to writing to each other constantly, and none of it required a new invention. It required only that the price stop being frightening. One piece of friction remained at the sending end. To post a letter, you still had to take it somewhere, to a receiving house, to a post office, during hours that suited the post office rather than you. That was solved in the 1850s, and it was solved in part by a post office surveyor's clerk who had seen roadside letterboxes in France and thought they would answer very well at home. His name was Anthony Trollope, and he would later be rather better known for other work. The first 4 pillar boxes in the British Isles were erected in St. Helier, on Jersey, on the 23rd of November, 1852, cast in a local foundry. Guernsey followed in the February. The mainland followed that September. London waited until 1855 and then filled up with them. And there it is, finished, without anyone quite intending it. Posting a letter had become something you did on a walk. Sending had become cheap, prepaid and flat rate, the same penny to your mother in the next street and to a man in Aberdeen you had never met. The recipient no longer paid. The recipient, therefore, no longer had a vote. Every safeguard against unwanted mail had lived inside the old pricing, and the old pricing was gone. Which meant that a new kind of letter was now possible, one that the sender pays for, in advance, willingly, one that arrives at no cost to the person who receives it, and no cost, therefore, to the person who did not want it. The machinery was in place, humming quietly, waiting for someone to notice what it could be used for. Someone would. And so we arrive at the strangest stretch of this whole story, which is the period, roughly 60 years of it, when unsolicited mail was not merely tolerated, but longed for. To understand it, you have to picture a farmhouse a long way from anywhere, somewhere in Illinois or Nebraska, or the flatter parts of Kansas, in the years just after the American Civil War. The nearest town is a half-day's journey by wagon. The nearest shop is a general store, 1 room deep, whose owner buys in small quantities at high cost, extends credit through the long months between harvests, and charges accordingly. The farmer does not much like these prices, but the farmer has nowhere else to go. There is no other supply of goods within a day's travel, and a day's travel is not a thing you spend lightly when there are animals to feed. Into this situation, in Chicago in 1872, walked a man named Aaron Montgomery Ward. He had worked in the dry goods trade, and he had spent time as a traveling salesman in the rural districts, which is to say, he had seen the general store from both sides of the counter. He understood 2 things at once: that farmers were paying more than they needed to, and that the railroads and the postal service, taken together, now made it possible to reach a customer without ever meeting one. The business he began that year in Chicago is generally said to have started with a single sheet of paper. Not a book, not a brochure. 1 page listing goods and their prices, sent out to farming households who had not asked for it. Whatever else it was an unsolicited advertisement, arriving in the post, addressed to a stranger. The single sheet did not stay a single sheet. It grew, as these things do, first into a small pamphlet, then into a stitched booklet, and then into something that had to be described as a book, because there was no other word for it. Within a little over a decade, the Montgomery Ward catalogue ran to hundreds of pages and listed thousands of separate items, and the company had attached to itself the promise that would follow the whole industry ever afterwards: satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. This mattered enormously. You were being asked to send money into the distance to a company you had never seen on the strength of a woodcut and a paragraph. The guarantee was the bridge over that gap. Then came the second house. Richard Sears was a railway station agent in Minnesota who found himself, through an accident of a refused shipment, in possession of a consignment of pocket watches he had not ordered. He sold them, discovered he had a talent for it, and went into the watch business in earnest. He needed someone who could repair the things, and he advertised for a watchmaker. The man who answered was Roebuck. By 1893, the firm the two of them built carried both their names, Sears, Roebuck and Company. And Sears, who wrote much of the advertising copy himself, was describing his own operation as the cheapest supply house on earth. He was not a modest man. He was, however, an extremely effective one. What the two Chicago houses built over the following decades is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. The catalogues thickened year on year, past 500 pages, past 1,000, until a single volume weighed several pounds and required both hands to carry. And the range of goods inside them was not a range in any sense we would now recognize. There were clothes and boots and bolts of cloth, of course. There were plows and harnesses and cream separators. There were violins and organs and sewing machines, wallpaper, spectacles, gravestones, buggies, stoves, saddles, ringers, and eventually automobiles. If a thing existed and could survive a railway journey, someone had found a way to put it on a page with a price beneath it. And then, for a stretch of roughly 30 decades, Sears sold houses. This is not a figure of speech. From around 1908 until 1940, the company offered mail-order homes, hundreds of different designs, ordered from a catalogue like anything else, and delivered as a kit. The materials arrived by rail in freight cars as tens of thousands of individual pieces, the lumber cut to length and numbered, the nails, the fittings, the paint, the hardware, and a book of instructions telling you the order in which the numbers went together. Tens of thousands of these houses were sold across the United States, and a great many of them are still standing, lived in tonight, by people who may or may not know that their walls arrived as a parcel. It is one of the few cases in commercial history where a piece of unsolicited mail could result some months later in a house. None of this would have worked without the last piece, which was the delivery itself. For most of the 19th century, rural Americans did not receive post at home. Mail came to a post office, often miles away, and it sat there until somebody made the trip to collect it. Then, in the mid-1990s, the United States Post Office began experimenting with something called rural free delivery, carrying the mail out along the country roads and delivering it directly to farms at no extra charge to the household. The experiments worked. The service expanded, was made permanent in the early years of the new century, and spread across the country. And with it came the mailbox at the end of the lane, which is now such an ordinary feature of the American landscape that it takes an effort to remember somebody had to invent it. A little later, when the postal service began carrying parcels as well as letters, the last barrier fell. Now the catalogue and the thing the catalogue described could both come down the same road. The effect on an isolated household was not small, and it was not really about convenience. It was about price, and about choice, and about the quiet dignity of being able to compare. A family 40 miles from a city could now buy at something close to city prices from a list of goods no local shop could ever have stocked, and could see, in print, in black and white, what a thing was actually supposed to cost. The catalogue was a wish book, and a reference work, and a price authority all at once. Wish book was one of the names it acquired, in fact, though the households that received these volumes had others. In some homes it was simply the big book. In others, spoken half in affection and half in something close to reverence, it was the farmer's Bible, the thickest printed object in a house that might otherwise contain only one other. Children learned their letters and their numbers from it. People read it in the evening, the way you might read anything, for the pleasure of the pictures and the descriptions and the sense of a larger world that could, if you chose, be ordered. And when the new edition arrived, the old one did not go in a bin, because very little went in bins. It became wrapping paper and shelf lining and kindling and material for school projects, and in the use that everybody who tells this story eventually mentions, a supply of soft paper hung on a nail in the outhouse, which is a fate that awaited a great many pages of American commercial prose, and which is said to have ended only when the printers moved to a glossier, less forgiving stock. You do not need to remember any of this. There will be no test. But we should come to the thing that is actually interesting here, and give it a moment before we go on. The object we are describing is a thick book of advertisements, produced by a company for its own commercial benefit, delivered to a household that never requested it. By any definition we would use today, it is junk mail. It is precisely, exactly the category of thing that arrives in your hallway now and travels to the recycling without being opened. And for something like 60 years, it was one of the most anticipated arrivals of the year. People waited for it. People kept it. People taught their children to read from it. Nothing about the object had changed. What changed was how much of it there was. When advertising is scarce, it is information. When it is endless, it is noise. The difference between the wish book and the pile of leaflets on your doormat is not craft, or honesty, or even intent. It is simply abundance, and abundance is the thing that turns a gift into a nuisance. What happens next is the part of the story that people tend to skip, because it involves committees. But it is the part that matters, because this is where a habit becomes a profession, and a profession becomes a science, and a science acquires the one thing it never wanted, which is a nickname. By the early years of the 20th century, sending advertising through the post was no longer an eccentric thing that a dentist might try. It was a line of work. And lines of work in that period did what lines of work do. They organized. In 1917, in the United States, an association was formed to represent the interests of firms that advertised by mail, and it called itself the Direct Mail Advertising Association, which is a name of admirable plainness. Over the following decades, it changed that name more than once, and each change is worth noticing, because each one quietly removed a word that had begun to feel like an admission. First, the word advertising softened into marketing. Then, in the 1970s, the word mail disappeared altogether, and the organization became simply the Direct Marketing Association. The letters were still letters, the envelopes were still envelopes, but the name on the door had been sanded smooth. There were conventions, there were awards, there were men in good suits standing at lecterns in hotel ballrooms, explaining to an audience of their peers the correct weight of a reply envelope, and being listened to seriously because they were right. There were trade journals and rate cards, and a body of working knowledge accumulating year on year in the ordinary way that any craft accumulates it. Somewhere in there, the practitioners arrived at a rule of thumb that is generally credited to a man named Edward Mayer, and it went like this: 40% of your result comes from the list, 40% comes from the offer, the remaining 20% comes from everything else: the writing, the design, the photograph, the color of the envelope, all the parts that anyone outside the trade would have assumed were the whole of it. Sit with the first 40 for a moment, because it is the hinge of everything that follows. The most important element of a piece of advertising mail is not the advertising, it is the list of people who receive it. And once that is understood, a list stops being a piece of administrative housekeeping and becomes an asset, something you can value, something you can own, something that can be rented out for a single use at a price per 1,000 names, brokered by a middleman who takes a commission, swapped with a rival in the same trade on agreed terms, or sold outright when a company folds. Lists were segmented and resegmented by how recently a person had bought something, by how often, by how much they had spent, and the segments were priced accordingly, because a name that had recently parted with money was worth considerably more than a name that had merely once existed. The people on the list were, in the language of the business, records, and the records were inventory. There is a quiet strangeness in that which is worth stating plainly, without alarm. If you lived in a country with a postal service and bought anything by post, then somewhere in an office you had never visited there was a line with your name on it, and that line was property, and the property was not yours. You could not read it. You could not correct it. You were, in a modest and entirely legal way, an entry in somebody else's inventory of entries. Nobody had done anything to you. That was simply the shape the thing had taken. Which raises a practical difficulty. If you rent a list to a stranger for one use, and the stranger physically holds the names, how on earth do you stop him keeping them and using them again for nothing? You cannot watch him. You cannot audit his intentions. So the industry solved it the way clever industries solve unenforceable problems, which is by hiding a tripwire in the merchandise. The practice is called salting or seeding. Before a list goes out, its owner inserts a small number of names that do not belong to anyone. Sometimes an invented person at a real address belonging to an employee. Sometimes a real person with a deliberately misspelt surname, or a middle initial that varies according to which client received the file. The mailing addressed to these phantoms comes back to the list owner, and it comes back carrying its own evidence. If a mailing arrives for a person who has never lived at that address and never lived anywhere at all, then the list has been used, and the initial in the middle of the name says by whom. Map makers have done something similar for a long time, drawing a street that does not exist so that a copied map convicts itself. But there is a particular flavor to the postal version, because the decoy is not a line on paper, it is a resident. There are houses that have received post for decades addressed to somebody who was never born, and the letters keep arriving, and the household keeps forwarding them, and the fictional person accrues a kind of documentary life, offers, congratulations, final reminders, entirely in the service of catching a thief. Alongside the salting came hygiene, which is the industry's own word for it. Lists decay, people move house, marry, change their names and die, and the list does not notice unless it is made to notice. So the files were merged and purged against one another to strip duplicates, matched against change of address records, and pruned of the deceased on the entirely unsentimental grounds that postage spent on a person who has moved away is postage burnt. The man who gave all of this its name was Lester Wunderman. He had built his career in the 1950s and 60s on advertising that asked the reader to do something and then counted how many did. Work for a record club, for a charge card company, campaigns built around coupons and reply cards, and in one celebrated case, a small gold box printed in a magazine advertisement that readers were told to look for, purely so that the number who looked could be measured. In a speech at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1967, he set out the idea as a discipline in its own right and called it direct marketing, advertising that addresses one named individual rather than a crowd, and that lives or dies by a measurable response rather than by anyone's opinion of it. Most advertising hopes, This kind counts. And what the counting revealed is the genuinely counterintuitive fact at the center of the whole business, the one that explains everything you have ever pulled out of your own postbox with a sigh. A campaign that persuades 2 people in 100 is a good campaign. A campaign that persuades a fraction of 1 person in 100 can still be an excellent piece of commerce, provided the cost of each piece is low enough and each converted customer is worth enough. The arithmetic simply does not care about the 98. They are not a failure of the mailing. They are the assumed and budgeted condition under which the mailing was sent. This is why the industry has never been wounded by the knowledge that almost everyone throws it away. Almost everyone throwing it away is the plan. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. The cost per piece, meanwhile, was driven down by an arrangement of some elegance. Bulk postal rates rewarded senders who did part of the post office's job for it, sorting the mail by postal district before handing it over, bundling it, trayed and labeled, and later printing machine-readable barcodes directly onto the envelopes. The postcode systems, introduced from the 1960s onward and refined with extra digits in the 1980s, made that sorting finer and the discount deeper. The mail traveled cheaply because it arrived already organized. Every fraction of a penny saved lowered the response rate the sender needed in order to profit, which meant more could be sent, which meant more arrived.
Somewhere in the middle of the century, ordinary people gave the whole enterprise its real name, and they did not consult anybody. The phrase junk mail was in circulation by the 1950s, and it settled in with the finality that only genuinely useful words achieve. The trade fought it for decades in the only way available, which was by offering alternatives: direct mail, advertising mail, addressed media, each of them accurate, each of them reasonable, and not one of them ever repeated by a single human being standing over a bin. The industry won the economics comprehensively and lost the vocabulary completely, and the vocabulary is the part everybody remembers. There is a particular kind of comfort in watching a thing happen twice, not the comfort of surprise, which is brief and rather tiring, but the slower comfort of recognition, of seeing a shape you already know appear in an unfamiliar material, the way a rhyme arrives at the end of a line you had almost forgotten was a poem. So we come now to the second time, and the pleasure of it is that almost nothing about it is new. To understand it, we have to picture a network that no longer exists, and that would be very difficult to explain to anyone who has only ever known the present one. The ARPANET was built with money from the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the United States Department of Defense, and it connected, at first, a handful of research computers at universities and laboratories and a few defense contractors. It grew, but it grew slowly and in a particular direction, which is to say, towards other people who were already, broadly speaking, the same sort of person. The users were researchers, they were graduate students, they were the engineers who kept the machines running, and the administrators who signed the paperwork that let the machines exist. There were, by the late 1970s, some thousands of them, which sounds like a great many until you remember that they were distributed across a continent and organized into laboratories, and that a fair proportion of them had met one another at conferences, or had at least read one another's papers. It was, in other words, a village. Not a village in any romantic sense. The machines were enormous and temperamental, and the etiquette was largely unwritten, and a good deal of what passed across the wires was administrative tedium of the very driest kind. But it had the properties of a village. There was an assumption of shared purpose. There was an assumption that if you sent a message to someone, you had a reason, and that the reason was more or less the reason the network had been built for. There was no lock on the door,
because nobody had yet found a use for a lock. On the 3rd of May, 1978, a man named Gary Thwerk sat down to send a message. Thwerk was a marketing man at the Digital Equipment Corporation, a company that made computers in Massachusetts and was at that moment doing rather well at it. DEC had new machines to show and had arranged 2 open houses in California later in that month, one in Los Angeles, one in San Mateo, at which people who might reasonably be expected to buy a very large computer could come and look at a very large computer. Thwerk's problem was the ordinary problem of his profession. He had an event, and he needed the right people to know about it, and the right people were precisely and exclusively the people on the ARPANET. So he sent them all an invitation. Every user on the West Coast, or as near to every user as he could assemble. Something in the region of 400 addresses, the figure usually given as 393. And here is the detail worth holding on to, because it is the detail that makes the whole thing human. The list was typed out by hand. There was no tool for this. There was no database of recipients, no field into which one could pour a mailing list, because nobody had ever wanted to do such a thing, and so nobody had built the means to do it. A colleague sat and typed the addresses, one after another, into the header of the message, and the header was not designed for a list of that length, and it overflowed. The names spilled out of the field that was meant to contain them, and ran on down into the body of the message itself, so that anyone opening it was met first with a long, unbroken wall of other people's addresses, and only then, some distance below, with the invitation. The invitation was in capital letters. It described the machines. It gave the dates and the addresses of the open houses. It was, by the standards of any later century, entirely inoffensive. The response was immediate, and it was furious. Complaints went back to Thwerk. Complaints went to his employer. Complaints went, more consequentially, to the people responsible for the network itself, and there the matter was taken up by Major Raymond Tsahor, who was the chief of the ARPANET management branch, and who called it a flagrant violation of the terms on which the network was to be used, that being a network for official government business, and not a place in which to sell anything to anyone. A message went out saying so. Digital Equipment Corporation was contacted. Thwerk was, in the language of the office, spoken to. There were assurances that it would not happen again. We should sit with that response, because it is the same response arriving from a different direction 114 years after the dentists of Harley Street. The objection is not really that the advertisement was untrue or ugly or badly written. The objection is that it was there at all. It had entered a space that was understood to be for something else, and in doing so, it had made that space very slightly less pleasant to be in, and the people who lived there could feel exactly how the arithmetic would go if the practice were allowed to continue. And Gary Thwerk, for his part, never apologized. He has been asked about it for decades now, at intervals by journalists who want him to express regret, and he consistently declines. He points out that he was doing his job. He points out with some justification that the people he wrote to were precisely the people who wanted to know about the machines, and that the open houses were attended, and that the campaign produced sales he has valued in the millions. He has called himself the father of e-marketing. He does not say it apologetically. He is, on the evidence, one of the few people in this entire history who has ever been asked to account for himself and simply answered the question. The word for what he had done did not exist yet. It arrived from somewhere else entirely. On the 15th of December 1970, the BBC broadcast an episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus containing a sketch set in a cafe. A man and a woman come in and ask what there is to eat, and the waitress recites the menu, and every item on the menu contains spam, the tinned pork product that Britain had eaten a great deal of during rationing and had not entirely forgiven. Egg and spam, egg, bacon and spam, 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 egg and spam. The woman does not want any spam. The waitress explains, with some impatience, that this is not really an option, and at a nearby table sits a group of Vikings who begin, quietly at first, to sing about spam, and go on singing about spam, louder and louder, until the customers cannot hear each other, until the waitress cannot be heard, until the sketch itself is more or less unable to continue and has to be abandoned to the singing. That is the whole joke, and it is a very good one, and its precision is what made it useful. What the Vikings do is not attack anyone. They simply repeat one thing until repetition alone has made conversation impossible. Early users of shared online systems, the text worlds and message boards and chat systems of the 1980s, took the word for exactly that behavior. To spam a discussion was to flood it, to post the same thing over and over until nobody else could get a word in, to win by volume rather than by argument. It was, at first, a word about drowning, not about selling. Then bulk commercial mail arrived and turned out to have the same effect on the same people for the same reason, and the word slid across and settled. By April of 1994, it had a case to attach itself to. Two immigration lawyers from Arizona, Lawrence Cantor and Martha Siegel, posted an advertisement for their green card lottery services to Usenet, not to one news group or a dozen, but to thousands of them, several thousand at least, which was very nearly all of them. The Internet's reaction was the loudest it had yet produced, mail servers overwhelmed by the replies, and a great deal of very sincere fury, and a sense among a great many people that something had been broken which could not be repaired. Cantor and Siegel wrote a book about it afterwards. The network objected. The network was right. The advertising stayed. What happened after that is difficult to describe in the ordinary way, because the ordinary way of describing a thing is to say how much of it there is, and the honest answer is that nobody can tell you precisely. The people who count unsolicited email are the people who build the machinery for stopping it, and each of them counts what passes through their own filters on their own networks, using their own definition of what counts. So the figures disagree with one another, and they wobble from month to month, and they have never once agreed to a decimal place. What they agree on is the shape. For most of the last quarter of a century, the majority of all email sent in the world has been email that nobody asked for. In the worst stretches, roughly the late 2000s into the early 2010s, when large networks of hijacked home computers were doing the sending, the estimates ran far higher than a simple majority, into the great bulk of everything moving. The proportion has come down since then, by most accounts, though it has never come down below half in any figure worth repeating as settled, which means that the ordinary condition of the world's largest correspondence system, for as long as most people have used it, has been that most of what it carries was addressed to someone who did not want it. The arithmetic that permits this is the whole of the story, and it is a quiet inversion of everything the catalogue houses and the direct mailmen understood. In the physical world, every piece has a cost. The paper costs something, the printing costs something. The envelope, the stuffing, the sorting, the sack, the walk down the path to the letterbox. Each of those costs something, and the something is small, but it is not nothing, and it is charged per item. That is why the response rates in the direct mail trade were watched so closely, and why a campaign that fell below a certain fraction of a percent was a campaign that lost money. There was a floor under the business, and the floor was made of postage. Electronic sending removed the floor, not lowered it, removed it. The cost of dispatching one more message, once the machinery is running, is so close to zero that it is not usually worth the trouble of calculating. And if the machinery is not even yours, if it is running on other people's computers without their knowledge, which for a long period was the ordinary arrangement, then the cost of the extra message is borne entirely by strangers who will never see it. And when the cost per item approaches nothing, the response rate to profit approaches nothing as well. It does not need to be 1 in 100. It does not need to be 1 in 10,000. It can be very much smaller than that, and still, at the far end, come ahead. A group of researchers in California went to the trouble of measuring this directly, around 2008, by quietly taking over part of one of these networks and watching what happened to the messages it sent. What they found was a conversion rate so small that it is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. Out of hundreds of millions of messages sent, the number of people who reached the end and actually bought something was fewer than 30. 30! And yet, the operation was, in its own terms, viable, because 30 multiplied by a real price is a real sum of money, and the hundreds of millions cost the sender almost nothing at all. That is the entire economics of the thing in one line. It is not persuasion at scale. It is failure at a scale so vast that the residue of success is still worth collecting. The same arithmetic explains a family of messages that has puzzled people for as long as it has existed, the ones offering you a share of a fortune belonging to a stranger, requiring only a small payment in advance to release it. The form is far older than email. Letters of that kind circulated in the 19th century, and the confidence trick they describe was old then. What has puzzled people is not that the messages exist, but that they are so bad. The spelling is wrong, the story is absurd, the details contradict themselves within a paragraph. The sender names a country so strongly associated with exactly this fraud that naming it is very nearly a confession. There is a proposed explanation for this, and it deserves to be given as a proposal rather than a finding, because it has been argued and discussed rather than proven. It was set out in 2012 by Cormac Hurley, a researcher at Microsoft Research, and the argument runs roughly as follows. The sending costs nothing, but the follow-up does. The long correspondence, the invented documents, the patient shepherding of one person towards a payment, that takes a human being's hours, and hours are the one thing in this business that remain expensive. So the sender's real problem is not attracting replies, it is attracting the wrong replies, the skeptical, the curious, the people who will waste 3 weeks of his time and then decline. Under that reading, the implausibility is not incompetence. It is a filter, placed deliberately at the top of the funnel, designed to be so obviously false that anyone capable of noticing will discard it, leaving only those who did not notice, who are, by definition, the only ones worth the hours. It is an elegant theory, and it may not be the right one. Some of the poor spelling is very likely just poor spelling, but it accounts for something that otherwise makes no sense at all. Against all of this grew up a defense, and the defense is now larger than the thing it defends against. Rules were written into the sending protocols. Lists of known bad senders were shared between networks. Then, in the early 2000s, came the statistical filters, the approach popularized by Paul Graham's essay of 2002, which proposed that rather than writing rules by hand, you could simply let the software learn from the mail itself which words tended to appear in the messages you wanted and which in the messages you did not. Laws followed in various countries and with various degrees of effect. And what all of that has produced is a situation that is worth pausing on for a moment. There now exists, distributed across the world, an enormous and continuously running apparatus whose entire purpose is to intercept messages before any person sees them. Most unsolicited email is now composed by a machine, sent by a machine, received by a machine, assessed by a machine, and disposed of by a machine, and at no point in that sequence does a human enter the room. It is a conversation between two sets of computers, conducted at great volume and considerable expense on the subject of goods that nobody wants, with no one present at either end. The folder where the survivors are kept is checked by most people rarely, and by many people never. And the physical version, which everyone assumed would die when the electronic version arrived, did not die. It is still delivered. In the United States, it remains one of the largest categories of mail the Postal Service carries. In recent years, the advertising mail has outweighed the ordinary letters, partly because the advertising held up, and partly because the letters went away. It arrives in real paper, with real ink, carried in real vans by real people, walking real paths, and it is picked up and carried to the recycling and put down. Unlike the electronic kind, it cannot be intercepted before you see it. Someone has to touch every piece. There are registers you can join. Preference schemes exist in a number of countries, the postal ones dating back, in some cases, to the early 1970s, where you enter your address and the reputable senders agree to leave you alone. They work in the sense that the volume falls. They work partially in the sense that they bind only those who have agreed to be bound, which is to say, the ones who were never really the problem. And so we arrive at tonight, and at a folder you did not open, holding a message you will never read, offered by no one you have met. In 1864, a firm of dentists in Harley Street sent a message to people who had not asked for it, because the machinery to do so had just been laid, and nobody had yet thought to say no. Everything since is the same act, performed with better equipment. The message in that folder and the telegram to those startled Victorians are the same object, separated by 160 years, and by nothing else of consequence except the price of sending it, which has fallen all the way down to nothing. And so we come slowly to the end of it, and to the shape that all of this makes when you stand far enough back to see the whole of it at once. Here's the shape. Someone builds a channel. They build it carefully, and usually at enormous expense, and almost always for some other purpose entirely, to carry news of a death in the family across 300 miles of wire in the matter of minutes, to bring a letter from a son at sea into his mother's hands for the price of a single penny, to let a handful of universities share their research across a continent without anyone having to post a magnetic tape. These are serious purposes. They are the reasons the money was raised and the poles were planted and the cables were laid along the seabed. And then, once the channel exists and works and reaches almost everybody, somebody notices that it reaches almost everybody, and that the reaching is now very cheap, and that among all those people who can be reached, there must be at least a few who want what he happens to be selling. That is the whole of it. That is the entire pattern, repeated across 160 years, with different machinery each time, and identical reasoning underneath. The dentists of Harley Street noticed it about the telegraph. The catalogue houses noticed it about the parcel post. The list brokers noticed it about the mailing list. A man with a room full of new computers to sell noticed it about the network. None of them invented anything except the observation, and the observation is always the same observation. This thing goes everywhere now, and I am allowed to put something into it. The reaction is always the same too, which is perhaps the more interesting half. There is the letter to the Times. There is the word outrage, or intolerable, or an abuse of a public convenience. There is the sense, quite genuine, quite sincerely felt, that a line has been crossed which had never been crossed before, and that something must be done about it before it becomes a habit. And then it becomes a habit. The complaint is registered, and the complaint is even sometimes agreed with, and the thing complained of continues anyway, and within a few years it is simply part of the weather. Nobody ever won this argument. Nobody has ever lost it either. It just keeps being had, in each new medium, in almost exactly the same words, by people who have no idea they are quoting their great-grandparents. If you look for the one thing that actually changed across the whole 160 years, it isn't the outrage, and it isn't the ingenuity, and it certainly isn't the quality of the offers. It's the cost of sending. That is the only variable that ever really moved. A telegram to a member of Parliament cost real money, and so you sent it to a few hundred people at most, and you thought about which few hundred. A catalogue cost paper and printing and freight, and so it had to be good enough that somebody would keep it. A letter under bulk rate cost a fraction of a penny, and so you sent 1,000,000 and hoped for 1.5%. And then the cost of sending fell essentially to nothing at all, to a rounding error, to the electricity involved, and at that point the arithmetic that had always governed the practice simply stopped applying. Because when sending costs nothing, no response rate is too small to be worth trying. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it explains something that otherwise looks like a decline in manners. The telegram to the members of Parliament was, in its own way, a considered document. Someone chose those recipients. Someone decided they were worth the expense of reaching. Every step down in the price of sending removed a little more of that consideration, not because anybody became ruder, but because consideration is a cost, and costs get cut when they stop earning their keep. Everything else follows from that one falling number. The volume follows from it. The carelessness follows from it. The fact that the machines now read most of it, and that no human eye is involved on either end of the transaction follows from it. Cheapness did all of this. Cheapness is the whole engine. And here is the part that is hardest to get past if you let yourself think about it too long. Almost none of it was ever read. That is the extraordinary thing. Not most of it, almost none of it. The letter opened over the kitchen bin and dropped straight in. The envelope carried from the mat to the recycling in one continuous motion, without the walk ever pausing. The catalogue that went out with the newspapers. The message filtered into a folder that nobody has opened in 9 years. All of that effort, all of that paper, all of that thought about the wording of the first line, and the overwhelming majority of it completed its entire journey from someone's careful intention to a bin without once passing through a mind. Which does raise a question about the hour you have just spent, and we raise it gently. We have given 60 minutes of serious attention to a category of object defined almost entirely by not receiving any. This is either the least appropriate response possible or the most. It is honestly not clear which, perhaps both, perhaps something that nobody has ever looked at properly, deserves to be looked at properly exactly once and then never again. Think, before you drift off, of the weight of it, all of it together, from that first telegram in the spring of 1864 to whatever arrived this morning, every circular and every catalogue and every envelope with a window in it, every one of them carried by somebody in a bag up a path in weather, warehouses of it, ships of it, whole forests turned into it, pulped, printed, folded, posted, delivered, and thrown away largely within the same week. An enormous, patient tonnage of persuasion moving quietly through the world for 160 years, addressed to everyone and read by almost no one. And nearly all of it is gone now, not destroyed dramatically, just gone the way paper goes, bin, lorry, pulp, and then something else entirely. It didn't leave a mark. There is no monument to it. Most of it lasted a few seconds in the hall of a house whose owner has long since moved away. So there it is. That's the story. A dentist, a wire, a complaint, and then everything after. You don't need to keep hold of any of it. That's rather the point of this whole enterprise. It was never for keeping. Let it go the way the letters went, down and away, and forgotten by morning. The hall is dark now. The mat is empty. Nothing is coming until the morning, and the morning is a long way off yet. Somewhere out there the machines are still sorting, quietly, in rooms with no one in them. They don't need you. They never did. Nothing to open, nothing to read, nothing to answer. Let your shoulders down. Let your jaw unclench a little. That's it. The house is quiet. The night is doing its own work. You have nothing to attend to. Nothing at all. Rest now. Sleep well. And when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.